and open us in prayer. Let's pray together. God, thanks for today. Thank you for the privilege that it is to gather this way. Thank you for these glimpses into the lives and the work and the faith of other people who have engaged our own nation and in some cases the world through their faith. Be with us tonight as we kind of go off road here and talk about a different kind of thing. May this be a blessing to all of us. We pray this in your son's name. Amen. So as always, standard intro. We're in this to just to widen our perspective and deepen our own sense of being effective and confident in the ways that we engage the world around us in faith. Um, that's been important over this last year or so. I think the peculiar issues surrounding the current presidential administration have put people of faith in an interesting position, and that is because the so much and so many who are involved in the current administration use faith as permission to do what they're doing, as cover for the things that they are doing, and as branding for coddling groups of people around the country who support them, who may or may not be any more or less faithful than they are. And so I'll watch my language here because there's all kinds of ways for me to say this, but a lot of us and a lot of us who are in the clergy have had challenges this past year and a half that we did not prepare for. Most of us are come from traditions that that avoid overt political statements in our church ministries. What we do in our own time is our own darn business, but what we do at church, I think, is changing, and that's because so many of the issues that we are called to address are now happening in our government. And just for example, the um, the procession that Shelley and I participated in, I think that was back in February now, in Washington, D.C., brought together a few thousand members of the clergy across denominations to protest the way that immigrants were being treated by ICE and Border Patrol, and to take those concerns to elected officials in their DC offices. And so that was meaningful for us. That's not the first time I've been a part of a political rally, but it's the first time I've done it explicitly as a pastor. And I think these are times that call for that. Had lunch with one of my clergy friends in town. Some of you know Father Ian from St. Stephen's, and this is just it's what we end up talking about. How do we shake off the hesitancy to participate or to resist something, even that our government is doing, even if we're, uh, uh, for lack of a better term, even if we are to a certain extent patriotic. Um, it's May. I've already located my flag. This is one of the months where at the end of the month I will fly my flag, partly for Memorial Day and specifically for the date on which my uncle died in World War II. He was an immigrant. He had been in this country about 3 years and died in the U.S. Army fighting in Italy about 300 miles from where he grew up. So I come by my patriotism honestly. No right wing wacko gets to tell me what patriotism is. See, I slipped into informal language there, but we're a Gold Star family, and Gold Star families in World War II. You had Blue Stars for the number of people in your household who were in the service, and you got a gold star if one of them was killed in action. We are a Gold Star family, and that has had a huge impact on the Italian side of my family. So anyway, uh, still, clergy are being tested, I think, and Christians in general are being tested in our willingness to to openly resist things that go against the teachings of Christ, and especially, and maybe especially loudly, when they're done in the name of Christ and yet still go directly against what Jesus modeled and taught for us. So it's been it's been quite a year and a half, I gotta say. uh, so this week we're going to talk about a different kind of engagement. Um, and so it's going to take some background. I'm in my sweet spot when I get to give historical background. So, uh, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the United States was finally forced into the Second World War, which it had avoided for almost 2 years, almost 2 full years. Um, Actually, more than 2 years. It started in September of 39, and the U.S. had managed to stay out of it, and to supply people with things, but not fight in the war until the attack on Pearl Harbor. Um, that brought the Great Depression to a screeching halt. So the stock market crash, is in 1929. The U.S. and most of the world, banking collapses, farming collapses, manufacturing collapses. Uh, New rules were instituted to govern the way Americans invested. We all, whether you know it or not, we're all still following the rules that were established in 1933 and 34 for creating stock investments and securities investments. Um, 1933, I think I've already said this once either in a class or in a sermon. About 30 million Americans were out of work, and that's when the population was probably half the size that it is now. So the depression comes to an end because the U.S. is positioned to manufacture in huge numbers. We're not being bombed, and we're not being invaded. So, and since Germany also declared war on the US, so did Italy. That didn't matter quite as much. Uh, the nation was faced with preparing for uh, two wars on a scale that hadn't been seen before in two different parts of the world. Uh, and so that means putting together armies and navies and an air force, really, like I said, on a scale which had never been seen up to that point. The U.S. also had to look inward during this time, and as a nation of immigrants, we had millions of people living in the U.S. who were from the countries that we were fighting. Some Germans and Italians were interned during the war, but no one suffered as much as Japanese Americans in the Western states. On February 19th, 1942, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and that cleared the way for Japanese Americans to be arrested and detained and sent to in concentration camps. That was just a little bit more than 2 months after Pearl Harbor, and just about 4 months before the Battle of Midway. Now, maybe this is my nerdhood coming out here, but the whole Pacific War changes 6 months into it. The Japanese had destroyed much of the U.S. fleet, but luckily the aircraft carriers were not in that port. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, there's a battle out in the middle of the ocean uh, that involves multiple aircraft carriers. And Even though the war dragged on for another 3+ years after that, there was no chance after Midway, after the Battle of Midway, for the Japanese to win the war in the Pacific. And so one historian said, sadly, when countries prepare for war, they're inclined to keep the war going as long as they could. And that was certainly true for the Japanese and the Americans in that at that point. But all of these things happen within a fairly condensed period of time. December is Pearl Harbor. February, Japanese Americans start to be interned, and but 4 months after that, there's really no threat to the U.S. from the Japanese, either in Japan or the ones who lived in the U.S. More than 125,000 Japanese Americans were sent into internment camps. More than two-thirds of them were American citizens. They could only keep what they could carry. If they owned property or businesses, they had to sell them quickly, and there were all kinds of vultures out there buying things at pennies on the dollar. One historian tells the story of a woman who sold all of her family's property and belongings, valued at about $25,000 in 1942, for $4,000. And because banks were not available to Japanese Americans who were being interned, they just had to hide the money and keep it with them, not knowing when or if they would ever be released. All told, it's estimated that Japanese Americans lost more than $300 million in property and in possessions during World War II. Some of this was rooted in national security concerns. People just didn't know that much about the world. Americans in the 1930s didn't travel to other countries. There's no air travel, there's no easy way to do it. When you see a television show or a movie about people going to Europe, it's wealthy people, and they're going by steamship. That was not necessarily the story for a lot of people in the US. And they didn't teach about the world in most of our public schools at that time. They didn't travel, they didn't teach a lot about it. They were worried that an infiltration of Japanese Americans could help a Japanese invasion from Japan. Even that shows a really catastrophic lack of knowledge about the world. The Pacific Ocean is huge. It's 5,400 miles from Japan to California. That's twice the distance that from California to New York. In other words, they'd have to go twice the distance from the West Coast to the East Coast on the ocean with an invasion force big enough to do some damage in California. Just by comparison, the invasion force on D-Day took 125,000 men just 125 miles from Portsmouth in southern England to Normandy. And that's the biggest seaborne invasion still in the history of the world. There was really no danger of invasion on the West Coast. But it wasn't just national security. The war unleashed the kind of racism that has always been present in this country. When interviewed, the manager of the Salinas Vegetable Growers Company said this: we're being blamed with wanting to get rid of the Japanese for selfish reasons. We might as well be honest. We do. It's a question of whether the white man or the brown man lives on the West Coast. But many Christian denominations stood against the internment of the Japanese. About half, here's another thing I didn't know until this week. About half of the Japanese Americans interned during World War II were Christian. They had been in the US, they were citizens, they had gone to local churches. Some of them had kept their the faiths of their ancestors from Japan, but many of them had assimilated so deeply into American culture that they were churchgoers. They formed churches for themselves, oftentimes in the internment camps. Churches in the areas around the camps sent Christmas presents and other gifts during the course of the year. Oftentimes, they sent pastors on loan to the camps to run services and to lead Bible studies. The YMCA, which back then was still a religious organization, was active in all 10 American concentration camps. I'm not quite comfortable with the softened word of internment. Uh, the definition of a concentration camp is when you concentrate one group of people in one place so you can keep them under guard. And it's not a death camp. It's not, there weren't executions and, you know, gas chambers like we think of the German concentration camps. But but even that, it's just a terminology thing, and I really think it's important. There's death camps in Germany, run by Germany, all over Eastern Europe, and there's concentration camps which happened in all countries, including here. These are concentration camps. Um, the capture and imprisonment of Japanese Americans brought a wide range of Christian denominations and traditions together in both opposition and in service. Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Disciples of Christ, Quakers, Mennonites, and Catholics, and more, all worked together, both in political advocacy and also in providing care and uh, better food and clothes and gifts to people who were in the camp. All of them raised their voices and helped in tangible ways during the war and after the war. Because remember, those 125,000 people had to give up their businesses and their homes. And so resettlement after 1945 became a huge issue because all of those people needed homes. All of those people were seen, at least by some, with suspicion, no matter where they went in the US. It was a huge thing, and churches were very involved in that. And still, some of the racism that is endemic in the US raised its head. Churches in Colorado after 1945 campaigned against a proposed law that would make it illegal for anyone of Japanese ancestry to own a piece of property in Colorado. We're, most of you know, this is a hobby interest of mine here in California. This idea of who can own property is just one example of systemic racism in this country. Some churches opened their doors to resettled and to help resettle Japanese Americans. The First Baptist Church of Chicago, that in the mid 40s would have still been called a Northern Baptist Church. In 1950, they become the American Baptist Churches. This is a Northern Baptist Church in Chicago, called a Japanese associate pastor to create a Japanese congregation within their church. The Brethren and the Quakers, not two traditions that normally worked well together, joined to open hostels that housed over 5,000 Japanese young people who were being resettled. Other church groups formed scholarship funds that helped Japanese high school graduates to go to college after the war. I have a document here I'm going to read to you. This is about the Presbyterian response. This is from an article written by somebody that I know named Beth Hessel, who used to be the executive director of the Presbyterian Historical Society. Here's what she wrote. She wrote, although Presbyterians opposed the forced relocation of Japanese Americans into camps, quote, it was clear that the fight against forced deportation was a losing battle. She wrote her doctoral dissertation on Japanese internment and the PCUSA. Uh, an ecumenical effort led by a pastor named Chapman and the Protestant Commission had four purposes: to assist internment camp prisoners with their spiritual needs and provide stipends for those who provided ministry in the camps. Second, to arrange for furloughed missionaries to Japan to come back and serve in the camps while they were on furlough. Third, to take part in campaigns to influence public opinion about the internment of Japanese Americans. These are details we've already said, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens. And fourth, to serve as official mediators between the U.S. government and internees in the camps when they were resettled after the war. In other words, to help them get resettled after the war. So that's our own Presbyterian response, the way that we were active in that. We meaning us as our church tradition. So as I've been doing the last couple of weeks, I have a series of quotes for us to read through and walk through. These are responses from different Christian leaders and different Christian denominations around the country, and their response to this act on behalf of the U.S. government of placing Japanese Americans into concentration camps. Just because I don't want I want there to be a direct connection with how I started. These are people faced with something that is similar, even though it's bigger in scale, similar to what we Christians have faced in our response to ICE and the way that it has abused its power in rounding up both immigrants, illegal immigrants, and U.S. citizens with no due process, and in some cases, not putting them in concentration camps, sending them to countries which may or may not be places that they've ever been. So the reason this one jumped out at me as important is that a lot of the while the details are different, this is a similar thing. Speaking out and resisting folks within the government who are doing these kinds of things to people who are our neighbors. So let me just put up my share box here. So this is an official statement from the Disciples of Christ, which is an American denomination. We hold that all steps taken for this purpose should be within the framework of the Constitution and should be based upon evidence of or strong presumption of guilt. Now, right there, we could have said that all last year, right? In the ways that people were being rounded up on the streets, there didn't seem to be any acknowledgement of their rights under the Constitution, and they were picked up because of the way they looked, not because of evidence or a presumption of guilt. They went on to say, we believe that the whole principle of democratic liberty, as well as our future relations with Oriental peoples, is at stake in our treatment of the Japanese within our borders. We must demonstrate to peoples of enemy occupied, neutral, or colonial countries that we can maintain democratic liberties in wartime and that we believe in them for others as well as for ourselves. So these are one of the things I hope you notice in the quotes that we're going to look at, and there's 6 or 7 of them, is how contemporary the language sounds. I didn't edit any of this. I took these out of a book that tells this story. these are, I mean, there may be some a little bit of stilted language, which is more about mid 20th century American English than anything else. But the premise is here, these are things we would have said. Uh, we think that the whole principle of our democracy is under threat because of the way our neighbors who might be, who are perceived to be here illegally, are being treated within our borders. And who are we to talk about freedom and democracy and liberty and rights when we've denied them to people who look different from the mainstream? So that's the Disciples of Christ statement. The Methodists put out another statement. We deeply regret that the citizenship rights of many of them, the Japanese Americans, have been violated. We urge our church people to join in a positive movement to protect these people from threats of permanent loss of civil and economic rights. We seek with them for a new birth of freedom. Again, something some preacher might have said 6 months ago or 8 months ago. Um, you'll see a theme here too that the churches aren't afraid to step in and say and talk about constitutional rights. It's not just this. This isn't. We've added in the modern era. This isn't what Jesus would do. But a lot of these statements are focused on trying to win the argument by using the other side's argument, which is the Constitution and the way that our government is organized. Um, Joseph Hunter, who was the executive director of the United Christian Missionary Society, said the uprooting and transfer of almost 100,000 citizens without due process of law, without even declaring martial law, is the most severe blow which the Constitution and the Bill of Rights have suffered since they were written. The test of a democracy is in its treatment of minorities, not in the fact of majority rule. These are really good official statements on behalf of Christian organizations in our country. Uh, Another leader, Charles Clayton Morrison from the Disciples, who we've already seen some of what they did. He said, "It's time that all the churches stir themselves to make plain to the nation the tragic mistake that it is making. The method is not democratic, is not in accord with American traditions, and is not right." Churches oftentimes we get to talk about moral rightness. We don't often do it very well, but it's our prerogative to talk about the moral rightness of something happening. Nobody could watch the news over the last year about citizens being dragged from in front of their homes or from schools, immigrants, day laborers being picked up at Home Depot, and not have a sense that this is not morally right. Um, Galen Fisher from the Pacific School of Religion up north, writing in the Christian Century. For white Americans, it is a testing by fire of devotion to the letter and spirit of the federal Constitution and of their ability to hold justice and national unity above antipathy toward persons of Japanese race. For white Christians, it's a challenge to demonstrate that Christian brotherhood transcends blood and skin color. Um, so this one it makes a little bit more of an overt, explicit appeal to people of faith, and that this is not something that can be justified in this country by people of faith. And then, yeah, that's the final one. But I want to stay on this one for just a minute. He makes an appeal to white Americans. He's saying that this is really a test put in front of you to see whether you really believe the things you say you believe in your patriotism. in your uh, holding up of the Constitution as your as our us being founded on as a nation of laws. Do you really mean those things, or does your antipathy toward Japanese Americans uh, is that more important to you? I would have asked the same question to any ICE agent last year. Do you love America more, or do you hate immigrants more? Those seemed to be the only two choices. And then for Christians, it's a challenge to demonstrate that Christian unity is more important than blood or skin color or national origin. So, in the end, I think most of you know that in the end, uh, most Americans agree that this was uh, an error on the part of our government, that this was something that was not representative of who we are as Americans, was not okay for a country that at that point was still majority Christian to do this and to participate in this. Um, and I believe it's not until the Clinton administration that an official apology and a rescinding of that executive order was done. I'm pretty sure it was in the early '90s, early mid '90s. So, if you're interested in how churches behaved during World War II, I'll recommend this book. It's called A Cautious Patriotism. A Cautious Patriotism. The subtitle is The American Churches and the Second World War. And it's written by a guy I know, Jerry Sitzer, Gerald Sitzer. His last name is Sittsser. He's written a lot of books. He's if you trace American church historians by who they got their doctorate under, he got his doctorate under the most important American church historian of the 20th century, Martin Marty at the University of Chicago. There are all kinds of faculty members all over the country who got their PhDs with Marty. Uh, a cautious patriotism. And it does talk a little bit about, it talks about how churches responded to the war, with the war, which was a national crisis, right? This was 10 million Americans were in uniform during the span of the 5 years we were involved, 4 years we were involved in the war. Um, and while our casualties were dwarfed by the casualties of both our enemies and our and the big allies that we fought alongside, uh, the cost here was still great. 340,000 Americans died in the war, including my uncle. Um, but but the whole world was devastated after that. And as that was playing out, uh, American churches uh, had had a role to play in how American culture responded to the war. I think you've heard me say that even though it feels counterintuitive now, uh, having a flag in church was much more likely to happen in a mainline denomination in the 40s and 50s and 60s than it was in an evangelical church. Evangelical churches up until the late 70s and until now uh, were apolitical oftentimes. They were separate from, they kept themselves separate from the political process. It was the mainline churches that were the establishment churches, and that tradition of having flags in churches comes from middle of the road mainline churches, not from evangelical churches. Those things change with time. The session a few years ago, I made a pretty impassioned plea to have it be a session decision that we didn't the question wouldn't keep coming up about when I was going to put the flag back in the church. And so that's why we don't do it. Um, we worship just Jesus in there, and anyone from any country is welcome to worship Jesus in our sanctuary. Um, so, but during World War II, the churches were had a much bigger role to play in the formation and the unity of American culture. Lots of them were white English speaking churches, but there were, just like we heard, there were all kinds of churches that served immigrant communities, including Japanese communities. And so, anyway, there are all kinds of ironies, and a lot of that is covered in this book, um, which is really worth reading. So, for me, and I'll unmute us in just a minute, but for me, this is a different kind of a Thursday evening for us. It's not about a person, it's about Christian churches and the ways that they responded to an injustice in their midst committed by a government that they largely supported. And as I read through these comments and I read through the quotes and some of the narratives of what they did, I'm proud of them. I'm proud of their response to that. They knew they couldn't win, but they stood in opposition to make sure people knew it wasn't right, even if they couldn't make it stop happening. That's a lesson for us. Sometimes we have to stand in the street and say something isn't right, even if we can't stop it from happening. And so, with that, I'm going to unmute us.
Unmute.
Oh,
Yeah. I'm sensitive, George, that this is connected to your heritage, and I don't know exactly how closely this impacted you or your family, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just want you to know all day I've been thinking, how's George going to respond to this? um, but for all of you, is this a news story for you? Is this a surprise? Is this something you already knew? What do you think this shows us for our present day? Yeah, Ray, please.
well, if I remember right, as a kid, back then, along our cliff coast, there were lots of Japanese farmers who had row crops and things like that.
Hmm.
And then they were rounded up into the concentration camps, as you said. And if I also remember right, as you're going down San Joaquin Avenue towards the beach, there's still that big lot that has nothing on it. I want to think that that was one of the places that there was a concentration camp. And then a little further down on the right hand side, there was a fancy hotel or something way back in the old days, and I remembered that. And I remember even as a kid thinking, this is not right. Those people
Yeah.
were taken from their land, and
Yeah.
and then they were moved inland. They were moved into the valley somewhere after that. But all of the traces of that are gone now. But it still kind of hangs in my memory, and
Yeah.
I thought it was unfair then as a kid, and still think it is.
Yeah. It's so at some point, um, Japanese Americans in the camps were allowed to enlist, and they fought with distinction in primarily Italy, of all places. They were part of the American army that fought the Germans up the boot in Italy, um, in the year before D-Day. A lot of you will know Bob Dole. Bob Dole was in the U.S. Army fighting in Italy. That's where he injured himself, or was wounded. Uh, and the Nisei Regiment, which is the 442 Regiment, fought bravely and is one of the more decorated regiments in U.S. Army history. for their exploits in the Italian campaign. If I remember right, there's a regiment that was made up of Texans that was trapped in World War II in Italy, and it was the Nice regiment that rescued them. Uh, Not to be stereotypical, but the Texans at first didn't want the Japanese fighting on their side. And in the end, they showed them great respect for the ways that they had sacrificially come in and relieved them from being surrounded by the German army. So in LA in Little Tokyo, there's a monument and a museum to the 442nd in Little Tokyo. If you ever go to LA and you like the kind of thing, I encourage you to go do it. There's all kinds of great places to eat right around there too. Uh, some of the best ramen in Southern California, right there. Um, it was they got the 442nd in World War II got 21 medals of honor. Um, yeah, I'm just reading through because I didn't
So,
remember.
but did they get to participate in the GI Bill?
That's a great question. Uh, of course, black soldiers did not.
Didn't. Yeah.
Um, I would have because black soldiers also, for
Really?
the most part, were not allowed to serve in combat. I would imagine they'd had a hard time with the uh, keeping the 442nd out of the GI Bill, but I also wouldn't put it past them.
No, I wouldn't either.
So that's a great question, Margot. We can I'll try and look that up and know something about that. But so they did give them an opportunity to serve, and Japanese Americans enlisted in larger proportions than other immigrant groups did, and uh, in some ways, larger proportions from the concentration camps than free white soldiers, free white men did. So, uh,
There are devastating stories about the Japanese American GIs serving while they had family members interned
yes,
and what happened to them because medical care and things were not available to them. I mean,
yeah,
it's a awful chapter.
yeah, it's a bad chapter. I think I want to be nuanced and say that it wasn't great medical care, but there was a hospital at every camp,
Yeah.
and doctors got sent in oftentimes from local communities into the camps. That's one of the things churches did to send in. Uh, but yeah, I was just reading today about one guy who enlisted, even though his grade school age brother died in the camp because there wasn't adequate medical care for him. Um, the uh, Sorry, Margot, you have me curious about this. After the war, um, uh, forgive me while I read, and you're just watching me read. Sorry. Oh no, Nisei veterans were had access to the GI Bill as an opportunity to go to university. Many of the Nisei became doctors, dentists, architects, scientists, engineers, and politicians in public office. The Japanese American senator from Hawaii, Inoue,
Mhm.
was that his name?
Yes,
In a way, Daniel.
Daniel Inouye.
Yeah, Daniel Inoue, I think, was one of these soldiers. Um, so it's yeah. There's I just have never talked to I've never talked to anyone who thinks that was the right thing to have done then. But if you place yourself, a historian's job is to put yourself in a particular era and try not to be noticed as an interloper, as a visitor. And so I get the fear. these are there's no internet, there's no, if you're a working class person in California, you're not reading international news, not until the war starts. And they just didn't know anything. And you can never discount the racism among white Americans for people who don't look like them. Uh, yeah, Susan, please.
And I think another issue is all these decisions were made in Washington, D.C., and there were probably was a very small Japanese population east of California. And
Sure.
so it's your distance, you have no knowledge, and even the political leaders had very limited knowledge about.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up in Maryland in the 50s and 60s. There were very few Hispanic in our
Right.
community, so
Right.
and I think we had one Japanese girl in my class the whole time I was in school.
Yeah. Yeah. I grew up next door to a family called the Sugiokas. Sugioka. Is that a familiar name, George? Sugioka. Sugioki. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing it well, but the family that lived there had kids that were about my sister's age, so younger than me, and their dad, I forget if it was the husband or the wife's dad, he came to play with his grandkids, but he had been in the camp, and he was relieved that my dad knew about the camps and that they could talk about that. My dad was a history teacher too, so but yeah, so I did grow up in a community that had uh, uh, lots of Japanese Americans. I went to church with a kid named Kevin Hayashi. So Larry and then Tim.
Yeah, Rachel Maddows had a podcast about the internment, and according to her, it was not a clear decision in Washington, D.C. about whether to do the internment. There was debate. And it was only, I think, one person in particular, whose name I can't remember, that convinced Roosevelt to do the internment.
Yeah, that makes sense. I read the executive order today, and actually, I read it quickly, but I don't think it mentions Japanese. It mentions military leaders in any region of the country who perceive a threat can take appropriate action.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it's an unleashing of the. Now that I said that, I just want to make sure, because I read it. I read it quickly. It's Executive Order 9066 that results in Japanese American incarceration, but the actual text of it, whereas the successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage to national defense materiel. We now therefore, by the virtue of the authority vested in me as president and commander in chief, I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of War and the military commanders whom he may from time to time designate, whenever he or any designated commander deems such action necessary or desirable, to prescribe military areas in such places and of such extent as he or the military commander may determine. You can tell it's a government language. Blah, 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 blah. There's no mention here of the Japanese.
So it was an informal instruction that wasn't in writing.
No, it's in writing, but it could have happened to anybody.
It was, if the word Japanese is not in it, somebody was told that's what it means.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, I will say, as an Italian American, it's part of our lore also that that there were Italians interned in different places. I'm just looking. So I've got the second and third pages here. It's basically permission. I hereby authorize and all blah 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 to assist the military commanders in carrying out this executive order, including the furnishing of medical aid, hospitalization, food, clothing, transportation, use of land, shelter, and other supplies and services. It modifies an old order. Yeah, I've just now scanned the whole thing closely, and there's no mention of the Japanese. Isn't that interesting? I didn't know that till today.
Hmm.
But it allowed for Germans in some places to be interned,
Mhm.
and also Italians in some places to be interned. But nowhere, you know, it's even in saying that out loud, I get the obvious racism of that statement. Germans and Italians largely look like white Americans, even though in my family we refer to the white side and the Italian side. Uh, the but Japanese people were identifiable,
So
and
I've never heard that the German Italians were interred. So how many of them were?
not many, not many. I think in some communities, uh, uh, there were some concerns in New York. There was an act of sabotage at the Brooklyn Naval Yard that was attributed to an Italian saboteur. But there was also a partnership that didn't come out until after the war between the U.S. government and several heads of the five families, the mafia families in New York, who had deep connections in Sicily before the invasion of Sicily in 1943. And so one guy got his sentence commuted, one guy got his deportation commuted. He had been deported to Italy, and in exchange for helping uh, on the ground in Sicily before the American and British invaded, he was allowed to come back after the war. So
And
yeah, yeah, Margot and then Larry.
I was just going to address what Susan said. I need to look at my notes further, but there were internment camps, POW at that point. I mean, there was
Oh yeah,
POW camps of the Germans in the South.
in the South and in the Midwest. Yeah, I think there was a
So,
big one in Iowa, if I'm not mistaken. But
so,
yeah, yeah. Um,
but
you
that's
know,
different than what we're talking about for
yeah, I
sure.
mean that's prisoner of war. You know, they transported them all the way across the Atlantic to house them here.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that was all, and some of them stayed after the war.
Yeah.
Married American girls and stayed here. That's another common story. When I lived in Scotland, I was surrounded by Italian-looking people who had Scottish accents. And in both world wars, Italian prisoners of war were kept in Scotland. And after both wars, a lot of them stayed. The entire ice cream industry in Scotland, every company has an Italian surname. Uh, and the funny thing is after you go to Italy, who from Italy would stay in Scotland with that weather?
Honestly,
Uh, sorry, Larry.
You mentioned Midway. Pan American Airways had a flying boat called the Yankee Clipper that could fly from Oakland to Asia. I think it was Macau. First stop was Hawaiian Islands, and then it would go on to Midway, an island
Right.
hop. Well, they hadn't quite reached Hawaiian Islands, and they got a radio call that Pearl Harbor been bombed. Don't come to Hawaii. All right, so what do? They worked their way south, ended up in Australia, flew to India, flew across Africa, then flew across the Atlantic to New York. There's a book about this called The Long Way Home.
Wow. Yeah. I think most of you know I have an interest in World War II history. The Battle of Midway is fascinating. It's the ships that fought in that battle never saw each other. They were 100 miles away from each other. And it was all fought, most of it fought by the planes. and at first it's a disaster for the American Navy and Air Force. But a spotter found a Japanese aircraft carrier, and they were able to sink that, um, and ended up sinking four, which completely gutted what Japan was able to do in that part of the Pacific, and everything after that is just battle with a foregone conclusion. As costly as all the costly battles that we know the names of, Iwo Jima and Tarawa and Okinawa, those all happened long after that, 44 and 45. But there's no way Japan can win the war. They just keep fighting. Um, and so, yeah.
So John, if that's true, then why did we need to do the atomic bomb?
Because they kept fighting.
Right.
They kept fighting. They were still, there's still 1 million soldiers, Japanese soldiers in China,
Hmm.
and they still occupied parts of the South Pacific. I mean, they're
Okay.
still fighting. They just can't win. And there was, you're after Pearl Harbor, there was a strong, unified agreement in this country that Japan had to surrender, not just be contained. And the idea after the casualties of those small islands, Iwo Jima and Tarawa, and many of you will know this better than I do, the idea of invading the homeland, the projections were that it would cost between 500,000 and 1 million American dead, which is more than they lost in the whole rest of the war before that. So it's that's another decision that is, we see it now. You see it in 2026 eyes as a horrible moral error. And it may be, and I'm sure at some point it is, but the alternative was awful too. Probably more dead on both sides, just not as
Wow.
quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that part of the war is awful. And I'm sorry, but Japan's prosecution of the war is awful. The way they treated Chinese and Koreans. Yeah. Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, I'll finish off on a positive note.
Thank you.
Central Coast had a lot of Japanese farmers, Japanese American farmers up and down, especially in the Los Osos Valley area. And the Eto family was prominent in the area. And when they were interned, the neighbor, I think Don Fulmer, had said had said that we'll take care of your property, we'll collect receipts and stuff like that. Don't worry. And so when the war was over and the family came back, the Volmers handed them all the money,
Wow.
rents that they collected. We protected your property, which a lot of them had been looted
Yeah.
in southern areas.
Wow.
And so it's a real great story, and it's right here in San Luis Obispo County.
I love that story. I need more detail on that story. That's going to show up in a sermon
Okay.
because it's what we should have done.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah, Larry.
interject a humor here?
Yeah.
In San Francisco Bay, very south end, NASA's predecessor was called NACA, and they had wind tunnels. And the wind tunnels made a lot of noise. There's also spotters anticipating Japanese aircraft. And if they heard this noise, they thought it was Japanese aircraft coming in.
Oh,
Off the siren went.
yeah.
People in the wind tunnel hear it. They shut the wind tunnel down. Oh, the planes have gone away. The wind tunnel starts back up. Oh, they're back.
They're back.
Comes the siren. I don't know how many times they went through this cycle before finally somebody decided maybe these aren't airplanes.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Just one last recommendation. If you like old movies, if you've never seen Bad Day at Black Rock,
Spencer Tracy.
it's Spencer Tracy, Robert Ryan, Ernest Borgnine, Lee Marvin, Anne Francis, Walter Brennan, Dean Jagger. It's like everybody that was good in that era is in that movie. And it's kind of like a Western, but at its heart, the story is uh, a crime committed against a Japanese American man by somebody who had lost his son in the war.
You never see.
That's at the heart of the story. You don't really find that out, and I'm way past the statute of limitations on spoilers. This movie came out in the 50s, I think. Yeah, 1955. But if you haven't seen it, it's really it is a compelling movie about right and wrong, and about hatred, and it's very, very good. Yeah. Um, any other final comments? This is kind of a different departure for us tonight.
What was the name of the movie? Bad Day at
Bad Day at Black Rock.
Black Rock.
Rock. Okay.
Yeah. Spencer Tracy didn't want to play this part until they told him he could play it with one arm.
Mhm.
And so he plays it as a veteran who's lost his arm.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a very, very good movie. Makes me want to go. I'm going to watch it again this weekend. That's
There
me, my treat for myself.
I've seen it twice.
Yes, yeah.
Of course you have.
I just want to say I appreciate the grace that George has shown during this
Yeah.
whole discussion.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank you,
George.
George.
Yeah. And I'm open to any, George, if you've got any comment on this, you want to send me in a side note, I'm quite happy if I've gotten parts of this story wrong. So take this as an inspiration from a horrible part of our nation's history, that it's our job to stand in front of these things, even if we can't win. I think that's the part. That's the part we have to remember. Sometimes we're not going to change the government, but we can change the way our neighbor experiences Christians in the midst of crisis. And I think that's the witness ultimately of these church leaders and church groups during that horrible period. So let's pray together. God, we look back on these events in our history with guilt and, I think, appropriate amounts of shame. But we can also look back at the people, our brothers and sisters in Christ from a different generation, who stood up and made their voices and your voice heard. We pray that we can learn to do the same as we engage things that are happening in our own community and in our own nation. We pray this to you in your Son's name. Amen.